Hey, traveler. Tonight, I thought we'd talk about medieval assassins. Where are you in the world right now? And what time is it there? Let me know in the comments. It's wonderful to know where our fellow travelers are joining us from tonight. What would you do if the only way to protect your family, your city, or your beliefs was to eliminate a powerful enemy in the shadows? The medieval world, often romanticized in fiction, was a brutal place. Political intrigue was a common occupation, and assassination was its grim tool. We're not talking about James Bond here, more like a medieval plumber who also happened to be good at poison. Assassination in the medieval era wasn't a modern invention. It was as old as power itself. Kings, emperors, and even religious figures have been quietly removed for millennia. But the conditions of the medieval period, fragmented kingdoms, deeply personal rivalries, and a complex web of alliances made it an especially appealing tactic. It was the ultimate unsubscribe button for rulers nobody wanted, and often cheaper than a full-blown war. Now that we've introduced the topic, let's delve into its roots. If you've ever felt powerless against a large corporation, imagine that feeling multiplied by 1,000, but with swords and castles involved. The medieval world offered few avenues for dissent. Elections, barely a glimmer. Peaceful protests, guaranteed to get you labeled a heretic or traitor. Assassination, then, became a desperate measure, a last resort when all other options were closed. It was medieval crowdsourcing, except instead of funding a project, you were funding a really bad day for someone in power. But who were these shadowy figures? Were they sociopaths with a thirst for blood? Idealists willing to sacrifice themselves for a cause? The answer, of course, is it depends. Some were genuinely convinced that their actions were justified, even divinely ordained. Others were simply desperate men and women, coerced or bribed into service. It's like the medieval gig economy, but with a significantly higher risk of getting your head chopped off. The types of individuals who turned to this profession varied widely. Some were skilled warriors, trained in stealth and combat. Others were scholars or apothecaries, knowledgeable in the art of poisons and deception. And still others were simply unlucky souls caught in the wrong place at the wrong time, forced into service by powerful figures. It was like a very dark and dangerous version of Take Your Child to Work Day. The motivations for becoming an assassin were just as diverse. Some were driven by religious zeal, believing they were doing God's work by eliminating heretics or infidels. Others were motivated by political ambition, seeking to advance their own careers or the interests of their families. And still others were simply motivated by greed, willing to kill for the right price. From one perspective, this is very different from the modern world. But maybe not really, depending on your point of view and personal life. The dangers of the profession were immense. Assassins faced the constant threat of discovery, torture, and execution. If they succeeded in their mission, they often had to flee for their lives, becoming outlaws hunted by the very people they had sought to serve. It was a high-risk, low-reward job, unless you consider a quick death a reward. But what good is assassination without a method? The techniques used by medieval assassins were as varied as their motivations. Some preferred direct methods, such as stabbing or poisoning their victims. Others employed more subtle tactics, such as spreading rumors or planting evidence to discredit their targets. It was like a medieval game of Clue, except instead of Professor Plum in the library, it was a disgruntled peasant with a rusty dagger in the privy. Poisons were a favorite tool of the medieval assassin. They were relatively easy to administer and could be difficult to detect. Arsenic, hemlock, and belladonna were all common choices. However, the effectiveness of these poisons was often unpredictable, and many assassins ended up poisoning themselves or their intended victims survived with permanent damage, sort of like medieval cooking. Speaking of poisons, this brings us to the moral complexities of assassination. Was it ever justified? Was it ever right to take a human life, even in the name of a greater good? These are questions that philosophers and theologians have debated for centuries. But in the medieval world, where the lines between right and wrong were often blurred, the answers were far from clear. Key takeaway: assassination in the medieval era was a desperate measure born of political instability, personal rivalries, and a lack of other options. Long before reality TV, medieval rulers understood the power of propaganda. Assassination was not just about eliminating a target, but about sending a message. A public execution, a carefully orchestrated rumor campaign, or even a well-placed song could all be used to shape public opinion and solidify power. The difference between medieval and modern propaganda: they didn't have Twitter, but they had town criers. Sure, it wasn't perfect, but when your alternative was a revolt, a bit of carefully crafted storytelling suddenly looked brilliant. From propaganda, let's transition to the consequences of this drastic act. Now that we've covered the origins and methods of medieval assassination, let's consider its impact on society. Did it lead to greater stability or simply to more violence? Did it deter potential tyrants or encourage further acts of treachery? These are difficult questions to answer, but it's clear that assassination was a destabilizing force, contributing to a climate of fear and uncertainty. It was medieval clickbait, designed to grab attention and sow discord. But what about the victims? Were they all ruthless tyrants who deserved to die? Or were some of them simply victims of political circumstance? The truth is likely a mixture of both. Some were undoubtedly cruel and oppressive rulers who had earned the hatred of their people. Others were simply caught in the crossfire of power struggles. It's sort of like Game of Thrones, but with less dragons and more questionable hygiene. The legacy of medieval assassination is complex and multifaceted. On the one hand, it serves as a reminder of the brutality and ruthlessness of medieval politics. On the other hand, it also highlights the courage and determination of those who were willing to risk their lives for their beliefs. It's a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there are always those who are willing to fight for what they believe is right, even if it means resorting to violence. Key takeaway: medieval assassination was a tool of last resort, with far-reaching consequences for both perpetrators and victims, and a lasting impact on the political landscape. The air hangs thick with the scent of wood smoke and something vaguely off. What would you do if your days were spent memorizing the subtle art of poisoning someone with a mushroom? Probably question your life choices, right? Medieval assassin apprentices didn't have that luxury. Welcome to their world of relentless training. Forget the sleek, ninja-like figures of popular imagination. Medieval assassins weren't leaping across rooftops in perfectly coordinated stealth. The reality was grittier, more desperate, and often involved a lot more mud. Now that we have set the scene, let's delve deeper into the practical skills of training, resources, and tools for the job. An apprentice's journey began early, often in childhood. Learning came from a master, perhaps a disgraced knight or a cunning apothecary, someone who knew the dark arts of survival. Training started with physical conditioning, endless hours of running, climbing, and wrestling. Think CrossFit, but with the added incentive of don't get killed. Seriously. Key takeaway: survival demanded peak physical fitness. Next up, weaponry. Swords, daggers, bows. The apprentice needed proficiency with all, but the focus was on subtlety. Forget flashy swordplay. The goal was quick, silent elimination. Training involved practicing in dark corners, learning to move without sound, and mastering the art of the hidden blade. Ever tried concealing a dagger up your sleeve without accidentally stabbing yourself? These guys did it daily. Speaking of weapons, this brings us to the more insidious tools of the trade: poisons. Poison lore was a crucial part of the curriculum. Apprentices had to learn to identify poisonous plants, understand their effects, and administer them effectively. This wasn't just about memorizing names. It was about understanding dosages, antidotes, and the art of masking the poison's taste. Imagine trying to make arsenic palatable. Now that is a challenge for the books. Key takeaway: poison was a science, not just a random act. Stealth wasn't just about moving quietly. It was about observation, disguise, and manipulation. Apprentices learned to blend into crowds, mimic accents, and gather information without raising suspicion. It was a constant game of cat and mouse, where one wrong move could mean death. If you've ever tried eavesdropping on a conversation, you get a tiny taste of what they dealt with daily. This would require dedication and sacrifice. But what good is physical prowess and knowledge of poisons without mental fortitude? Mental conditioning was perhaps the most grueling aspect of the training. Apprentices faced constant psychological pressure, designed to break them down and rebuild them into ruthless killers. They endured sleep deprivation, isolation, and simulated combat scenarios, all intended to harden their minds and bodies. Key takeaway: mental toughness separated the survivors from the victims. Acquiring and maintaining tools and skills was a constant challenge. Resources were scarce, and apprentices often had to improvise. They might steal materials, scavenge for ingredients, or barter for services. Imagine trying to buy poison ingredients with nothing but a few stolen coins. Now that is a difficult task. From tools to resources, life was not easy. The tools of the trade weren't always glamorous. A simple dagger, a vial of poison, a length of rope, These were the weapons of choice, but they had to be maintained meticulously. A dull blade could mean the difference between success and failure. Ever tried sharpening a knife with a river stone? Medieval assassins knew all about it, and they perfected it. Now that we've covered their training, let's talk about the tools they used. The medieval assassin didn't have access to Amazon. Forget ordering a custom-made poison kit online. The difference was resourcefulness. Sure, it wasn't perfect, but when your alternative was dying because you couldn't procure the right ingredients, improvisation suddenly looked brilliant. They were clever. Speaking of resourcefulness, acquiring rare ingredients like specific herbs or venomous creatures was a constant struggle. This often involved dangerous expeditions into the wilderness or dealings with shady merchants who might be willing to betray you for a higher price. Can you imagine having to negotiate for deadly poison with a guy who clearly wants to kill you? That would be a challenge. Key takeaway: every ingredient was a hard-won victory. Let's explore maintaining their skills further. Imagine trying to practice your swordsmanship in secret without drawing attention. Apprentices had to find secluded training spots, often risking discovery and punishment. It was a constant balancing act between honing their skills and staying out of sight. Think about it. You would need an extremely safe place to not draw any attention. Disguise was another essential skill. Medieval assassins had to be masters of deception, able to transform themselves into different characters at a moment's notice. This required a keen eye for detail, an understanding of human behavior, and the ability to act convincingly. Ever tried pretending to be someone you're not? These guys did it for a living. So the question is, how did they do it? From training to tools, the life of a medieval assassin apprentice was one of hardship, sacrifice, and constant danger. It was a world far removed from the romanticized portrayals of assassins in popular culture. It was a brutal reality where survival depended on skill, cunning, and a willingness to do whatever it took to survive. So remember, if you ever think your job is tough, just be glad you're not a medieval assassin apprentice. At least you can get a good night's sleep.
The flickering candlelight casts long shadows, doesn't it? Perfect for contemplating the murkier corners of history. Tonight, we're not admiring kings, but peering into the lives of those who dared or were compelled to shorten their reigns. Let's discuss what it truly meant to be a medieval assassin, and more specifically, how they got those rather unpleasant job offers. Contracts and kings, a match made, well, somewhere considerably warmer than heaven. If you've ever negotiated a raise, you have a tiny, minuscule inkling of what a medieval assassin faced. But instead of dental, it's dealing with lords who might flinch, change terms at whimsy, betray you outright after the deed. Who hired these shadowy figures? The answers are as varied as the patterns on a Persian rug, though slightly less likely to improve your living room. Kings, naturally, were prime customers. A rival king, a troublesome uncle, a wife who'd outlived her usefulness, all valid reasons for a royal hit. But so were nobles, wealthy merchants, even the church, when heresy became too loud or political opposition too inconvenient. Think of it as medieval outsourcing of conflict resolution. The motives? Power, pure and simple. Or perhaps the more nuanced, power to retain one's existing power. Now that we've established the who and the why, let's delve into the how. How exactly does one put out an ad for a discreet executioner in the 14th century? Certainly not LinkedIn. Contracts were rarely written, for obvious reasons. A handshake, a whispered agreement in a darkened alley, a coded message delivered by a trusted intermediary. These were the tools of the trade. Imagine trying to sue someone for breach of contract when the contract is "silence that annoying Duke." Good luck with that small claims court appearance. But what good is a contract without enforcement? This is where things get truly medieval. Payment was often in stages, a down payment up front, a larger sum upon completion, and perhaps a bonus for particularly artful work. But what if the employer reneged? Well, the assassin had options, albeit rather limited ones. They could seek revenge, of course, but that risked exposing themselves and their network. They could try blackmail, but that only worked if the employer had something to lose. Or, most pragmatically, they could simply move on and find a new target. After all, disgruntled clients tend not to be repeat customers. Speaking of moving on, the danger of betrayal loomed large. Double-crossing was practically a national sport in the medieval world. An assassin might be hired to kill one person, only to discover that they were in fact a pawn in a much larger game. Or worse, they might complete the job only to be betrayed by their employer, who wanted to eliminate any trace of their involvement. It was a cutthroat industry, quite literally. Trust was a rare commodity, and paranoia was practically a job requirement. Let's make a modern comparison. We have non-disclosure agreements and lawyers, but medieval assassins had to be their own lawyers, investigators, and bodyguards all rolled into one. The difference was a lack of formalized systems. Sure, it wasn't perfect, but when the alternative was probable execution by angry noblemen, a quiet demise after one or two successful hits suddenly looked brilliant. But betrayal could also come from within. Assassin guilds were notoriously secretive and hierarchical. Jealousy, ambition, and plain old greed could all lead to internal strife. An assassin might be betrayed by a rival who wanted to take their place, or by a superior who saw them as a threat. The life of a medieval assassin was a constant tightrope walk, with a long drop into the abyss of betrayal on either side. Ever wonder why some assassins simply vanished after a few successful hits? Shifting allegiances added another layer of complexity. A patron who was powerful today might be overthrown tomorrow. An assassin who was loyal to one faction might find themselves on the losing side of a political struggle. Adapting, changing with the wind, or sometimes disappearing before that shift became a real problem. Now that we've gone through this treacherous career, let's consider in the modern era how contracts are signed to protect both parties. Medieval assassins? They had to rely on their wits, their skills, and a healthy dose of luck. The difference? Legal recourse versus, well, a swift death. Sure, it wasn't perfect, But when the alternative was total lack of any protection whatsoever, even a whispered agreement seemed like a step up. Key takeaway? Medieval assassins operated in a world of constant danger, where trust was a luxury and betrayal was the norm.
Blood on the cobblestones, the realities of the hit. Ever wonder what it was really like to be a medieval assassin? Forget the movies with graceful leaps and flawlessly executed plans. The reality was far grittier, messier, and a whole lot less glamorous. Think less Ezio Auditore, more a very stressed medieval postal worker, only instead of letters, you're delivering death. Now let's talk about the risks. Imagine trying to discreetly tail someone in a crowded marketplace. Today, we have sunglasses, hoodies, the ability to blend into a throng of tourists snapping photos. But medieval people, they had clothes, and everyone had the same clothes. The difference was subtle, the options limited. Sure, it wasn't perfect, but when your alternative was getting immediately spotted because you were the only one wearing a slightly different shade of brown, blending in suddenly looked pretty brilliant. Getting caught meant torture, public execution, and your family being ostracized. Not exactly a stellar career move. Speaking of getting close, access to your target was a nightmare. These weren't Renaissance princes throwing open their doors. We are talking heavily guarded nobles and paranoid rulers. Think about trying to sneak into the White House with a butter knife. That's the level of difficulty we're talking about. Key takeaway: medieval assassinations were less about skill, more about insane levels of patience and luck. But what good is access without a reliable weapon? Forget silenced pistols and poisoned darts. Medieval weaponry was, medieval. Swords were heavy, daggers were blunt-ish, and poison, while effective, was about as subtle as a trebuchet. And the aftermath? A bloodbath in the middle of a crowded feast doesn't exactly scream stealth. Speaking of trebuchets, try explaining that to the local guard. Oh, this? I was just practicing my siege weapon skills near the Duke's manor. Key takeaway: medieval assassination tools were crude, messy, and about as discreet as a blacksmith convention. Now that we've covered the practicalities, let's talk about the psychological toll. Imagine taking a life, knowing you're not just ending a person, but potentially triggering wars, famines, and general chaos. Modern therapists might suggest deep breathing exercises. Medieval assassins, they had religion, which probably offered limited comfort when you were staring down the barrel of eternal damnation. Sure, it wasn't perfect, but when your alternative was a complete mental breakdown, divine judgment suddenly looked somewhat appealing. Key takeaway: the mental burden of being a medieval assassin was crushing, leaving many haunted by their actions. Let's not forget about things going wrong. Plans rarely go according to script, especially when they involve sharp objects and unsuspecting victims. Picture this: You finally get close to your target, raise your dagger, and trip over a stray dog. Or the target sneezes, ruining your aim. Or the poison turns out to be a dud, leading to an awkward coughing fit instead of a dramatic death scene. The possibilities for failure were endless, and the consequences were usually fatal. Maybe the dog just wanted to play fetch with your dagger. It's a stressful life. Key takeaway: expect the unexpected. Medieval assassinations were a comedy of errors waiting to happen. From planning to execution, the life of a medieval assassin was a constant tightrope walk. It demanded not just physical prowess, but cunning, resilience, and a whole lot of luck. So next time you see a movie glorifying the art of assassination, remember the blood, the sweat, the sheer terror that went into every kill. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't easy, and it certainly wasn't for the faint of heart. And definitely not suitable for those allergic to dogs. Key takeaway: being a medieval assassin wasn't about glory. It was about survival in a brutal world, one risky hit at a time.
What does it truly mean to live a life draped in shadows, where silence is not merely golden, but a matter of survival? If you've ever felt the weight of a secret, magnify that 1,000-fold. Add the constant threat of a blade in the dark, and you might begin to glimpse the existence of a medieval assassin. The foremost burden was undeniably fear. Not the garden variety fear of public speaking or spiders, but the gut-wrenching, ever-present dread of exposure. Imagine living every moment knowing that one wrong word, one misplaced glance could mean imprisonment, torture, or a swift, silent end. Medieval assassins didn't have witness protection programs or burner phones. Their only shield was their anonymity. This constant state of alert likely aged them prematurely, leaving them perpetually exhausted and paranoid. Now that we've established their anxiety levels were higher than someone who just accidentally liked their ex's honeymoon photos from 20 years ago, let's consider the social implications. Isolation was the assassin's constant companion. Genuine human connection was a luxury they could rarely afford. Forming close relationships meant risking exposure, not only for themselves, but for those they cared about. Imagine the agony of watching someone you love suffer because of your choices, knowing you could have prevented it by simply remaining aloof. This existence fostered deep-seated loneliness and an inability to trust. Sure, monks took vows of silence, but at least they had each other and a shared purpose. The assassin was alone, their purpose shrouded in darkness, their heart a battlefield of conflicting emotions. The moral burden of taking lives weighed heavily on many assassins. While some might have been hardened sociopaths, others likely wrestled with the ethical implications of their actions. Was the cause they served truly just? Were the victims truly deserving of their fate? The medieval world was not black and white. Shades of gray blurred the lines between right and wrong. Living with the knowledge that you had extinguished a life, regardless of the circumstances, could lead to profound guilt, depression, and even madness.
It's like being stuck in a never-ending performance review, where the only feedback is the echoing silence of the dead. Speaking of moral quandaries, this brings us to the psychological impact of living outside the law. Assassins operated in the shadows, beyond the reach of societal norms and legal structures. This existence could lead to a distorted sense of morality, where personal gain and loyalty to a cause trumped all other considerations. The constant need to deceive and manipulate others could erode one's sense of self, leaving them feeling like a hollow shell. Imagine the mental gymnastics required to justify your actions day after day, year after year. It's like trying to assemble IKEA furniture with only a butter knife. Frustrating, exhausting, and ultimately damaging to your sanity. But what good is a life of secrecy and violence without considering the constant threat of betrayal? Trust was a rare and precious commodity in the assassins' world. Their employers, their colleagues, even their own families could turn against them at any moment. The motivations for betrayal were numerous: greed, fear, political ambition, or simply a desire for revenge. Living with this constant suspicion could drive anyone to the brink of madness. Every friendly gesture, every whispered conversation was viewed with suspicion. It's like attending a potluck dinner where everyone brought their own homemade poison. Now that we've painted a grim picture of the assassin's psychological state, let's consider the practical challenges they faced. Imagine the constant need to maintain a cover identity, to blend seamlessly into the background. This required meticulous attention to detail, a mastery of disguise, and an ability to adapt to any situation. One slip-up, one moment of carelessness could expose their true identity and lead to their downfall. It's like trying to parallel park a chariot in a crowded medieval street, stressful, precarious, and likely to end in disaster. The price of silence was indeed steep, paid in fear, isolation, moral compromise, and constant vigilance. Key takeaway: the assassin's life was a tightrope walk over an abyss of fear and moral ambiguity. The assassin's shadow, long after the deed is done, stretches far beyond the grave. What echoes of their actions lingered in the medieval world, where they feared, reviled, or, perhaps surprisingly, even romanticized? Consider this. If you were whispered about in taverns, would you prefer to be a monster or a myth? The historical record, often frustratingly incomplete, paints a complex picture. Royal chronicles detail assassination attempts, of course. Kings and nobles rarely appreciated unscheduled departures from this mortal coil. But beyond these official accounts, the whispers of the common folk reveal a different story. Tales of cunning individuals striking from the darkness sometimes resonated with those who felt powerless against the established order. Think Robin Hood, but with a significantly higher body count. Now that we've considered how the upper crust viewed assassins, let's delve into the perspective of the common person. Did they see these figures as instruments of justice, evening the score against tyrannical lords? Or were they simply agents of chaos, destabilizing an already precarious world? The answer, predictably, is probably both. Imagine a medieval peasant struggling to survive. A corrupt tax collector is suddenly found dead in a ditch. On one hand, terrible tragedy. On the other, lighter taxes. The ambiguity is key. But what good is an assassin without a legacy, real or imagined? The truth is often stranger and certainly more embellished than pure fact. Consider the stories surrounding the Hashashin, the Nizari Ismailis. Legends painted them as drug-fueled fanatics, blindly obedient to their leader, the old man of the mountain. While there's evidence of the Nizari's strategic use of assassination, the more lurid details likely owe more to crusader propaganda than reality. Even Marco Polo, never one to shy away from a good yarn, contributed to the myth. The power of these narratives, however, is undeniable. They cemented the image of the assassin as a figure of both terror and fascination. Speaking of legends, this brings us to the concept of the assassin as a folk hero. It's a tricky idea, fraught with moral ambiguity. After all, taking a life is rarely justifiable, even in the cutthroat world of the Middle Ages. However, when an assassin targeted a particularly cruel or oppressive ruler, their actions might be viewed with a degree of, well, understanding. Think of it as a medieval version of taking out the trash. This doesn't excuse the act itself, but it does offer a glimpse into the social context that might have allowed such figures to achieve a degree of notoriety, if not outright admiration. The line between villain and vigilante blurred in the dim light of the medieval world. Now that we've established an idea of public opinion, let's think of the long-term impact. What lasting impact did these clandestine figures leave on medieval society, both real and imagined? The historical records are peppered with assassination attempts, both successful and failed. These events often triggered political instability, power struggles, and even wars. The assassination of a monarch could throw an entire kingdom into turmoil, creating opportunities for ambitious rivals to seize power. And of course, each attempt, successful or not, bred paranoia and suspicion among the ruling classes. From the political arena to the realm of folklore, the assassin's influence was pervasive. The shadowy figure lurking in the darkness became a stock character in medieval literature and art. Think of the mysterious rogue, cloaked and daggered, forever plotting against the powers that be. These fictional assassins often served as allegorical representations of social unrest, political corruption, or simply the ever-present threat of violence. They were figures to be feared, admired, or perhaps even pitied, depending on the perspective of the storyteller. Hey, before we conclude, let's consider one final key aspect: the ultimate futility and tragedy of the assassin's life. For all their cunning and skill, most assassins met a grim end. Whether caught and executed, betrayed by their own allies, or simply consumed by guilt and paranoia, their lives were rarely long or happy. They were often pawns in larger political games, disposable tools used and discarded by those in power. Even those who managed to escape detection lived a life of constant fear, forever looking over their shoulders, haunted by the specter of their past deeds. So, as we reach the end of this chapter, and indeed of our journey through the shadowy world of the medieval assassin, let us reflect on the lessons we have learned. We have explored their motivations, their methods, and their lasting impact on the medieval world. We have delved into the legends and myths that grew up around them, and we have considered the ultimate tragedy of their lives. Key takeaway: assassins became figures of fear, but also unexpected folk heroes, their actions rippling across medieval society. And now, as the first hints of dawn begin to lighten the sky, and the world slowly stirs from its slumber, it is time to bid you farewell. Thank you for joining me on this nocturnal exploration of history. I hope that these tales of medieval assassins have provided you with a moment of quiet contemplation, a brief escape from the concerns of the day. May your dreams be peaceful, and may your waking hours be filled with light and hope. Good night.